I sometimes when I see these books, I get a little nervous because I feel like it's going to read like a textbook. This book does not read like that at all. This is a very entertaining, very engrossing read. It's chock full of just amazing information. Um, and I'm just curious, I guess, what drew you to the 50s? What brought you to this decade?
Okay, that's a good question and a basic question, and the answer is very simple. That was the era in which I grew up. It's my decade. So I was a kid at the beginning of the decade and a teenager by the end of the decade, and I was already a devoted moviegoer. So it was my movie going baptism, and so I had a very special feeling for the era because I saw a lot of films. Most of the films I write about in the book, I saw when they were first released. So I could bring a perspective of being there that a younger historian couldn't. And I did try to share my own memories of going to the movies in the 50s, but also people your age and younger generations have this idea that the 50s were the blandest, most conformist, consumer driven, drippiest, least interesting decade in American history. And I wanted to correct that misperception. Not true. It was a very complex era, political divisions almost as raw and intense as the ones we're facing today.
Yeah.
The blacklist, the fear of communism, us versus them, the Cold War escalating. It was a very complex and anxious period. And the idea of this bland 1950s was a cliche that I wanted to topple. And I hope I succeeded in doing that.
Well, what's fascinating is, the numbers certainly, if when you're looking at the 40s, you list these stats that I kind of found incredible, which was, you had like 80 million people going to the movies a week.
Oh, we
And then it's like you go up, in between the war years, between 41 and 45, you have almost 85 million viewers a week, going to these cinemas.
yes,
Um, can
an
you
incredible number.
Incredible numbers. I mean,
Incredible.
numbers that are just unheard of today.
Right.
Um, can you describe, how much different theaters were back then?
Well, your statistics already speak to that issue. Young people have no idea of what going to the movies was like in the 40s and 50s and 60s. Movie palaces, single screen theaters. We didn't have multi screen theaters. We had none of that. You went to you saw a movie at a single screen house with real architectural flavor and pizzazz, Mayan, Egyptian, classical, Art Deco, all kinds of architectural motifs. You saw movies in a fantastically imaginative, fanciful environment. Some of the theaters had 5,000 seats and they would regularly sell out. Can you believe that? Today, if a theater has 350, that's a huge theater. Thousands of seats. A neighborhood theater, which would be modest in size, would have had maybe 900, 800, and would regularly sell out. Today, with all the multiplexes, sellouts are rare. And there's some theaters in multiplexes, what, have 40 seats, 50 seats, the smaller houses? Unheard of in the 50s. There wasn't the same competition for people's entertainment time and money. So people went to the movies. It was a regular part of the fabric of American life in a way that it has never been since. So this summer, when movies like Barbie and Oppenheimer drew people back into theaters and not streaming, that was major news.
Yeah.
It was major news that there were movies out there that people actually went to a theater to see. Streaming has been very dangerous for movies, far worse than the threat of television in the period that I'm writing about.
You know, um, even touching more on the Oppenheimer kind of phenomena, we've had, several decades now where physical media has also been in decline. Um,
Yes,
even my day job is no longer selling physical media anymore.
really.
Yes. And what's crazy to me is that Oppenheimer, however, when it was released on physical media, sold out in a day. in under a week, the whole stock of that had sold out at multiple different stores, at multiple different retailers. And I think that spoke to me pretty strongly that, people will still continue to support films that they genuinely love. Whether it be on physical media or going to the theater for it. Um,
But it became newsworthy, Sam, because it was
yes,
a rare event. It
yes.
made headlines. The fact that those two films last summer drew in so many viewers, it made headlines because that's not the operating pattern. It doesn't happen.
Do you think, I mean, obviously there's been a trend of declining viewership for several decades now, but do you think that um, those those factors are more economic or more in the audience losing faith in the studio kind of system?
Good question, and both, but also the availability of streaming services where people are getting used, especially during the pandemic when we depended on our screens here to be connected to the world. It became easier to stay at home and to get a first run movie on TV or a big flat screen TV or on your streaming device. And that's going to be hard to combat. People did get very insular during the pandemic. I think we're still coming out of it. We're all scarred by it. So I think that's serious. But your other point is well taken too. I think people have lost faith in a lot of mainstream films. I think the Marvel phenomenon has run its course.
Mm-hmm.
I think the comic book series, the big blockbuster series, which Martin Scorsese brilliantly said, they're not movies.
Amusement park.
They're amusement park entertainment. They're not movies.
I agree.
They're not movies. They're not in the tradition that we're talking about and that I try to celebrate in my book and screenings. They're not. They're something else. But the public seems to have gotten tired of them and are going to more interesting, riskier films, which is there's some good movies this year, so it's encouraging and people are supporting them.
Well, like you had said, right? You say like in the 50s, America was more kind of politically divided than ever, like, maybe up until now.
Well,
Uh,
now we're really divided
yeah,
in
I
a way
mean,
that's getting more and more serious. But there was that in the 50s too. Nowadays, the term is if you don't agree with me, you're a racist. In the 50s, if you were a bad guy, you were a communist.
communist, yeah.
The words have changed, but the psychological mindset, I think, is basically the same.
You
Us
argue,
versus them, it's binary. There's so much
yeah,
tension between you and me if we don't see eye to eye on something.
yeah. I mean, that's the times, right?
It's getting only more intensified, and it will do so during this election year, where the divisions are going to become deeper and deeper, and the two sides angrier and angrier. I think we almost forget that we all live in the same country. We're all Americans.
When you look back at the 50s, you kind of argue that these movies were maybe more complicated than they appear to a younger audience. Um, can you describe, I guess, why you think they were more complicated and why they maybe weren't treating their audience like they were not intelligent?
But I don't think I don't. I hope I don't make that point.
No, no,
But
no,
what I
like they weren't doing that. They were not doing that. They were, I think now they are. I think
now
now,
they are. Oh,
yeah.
now they are. There's a kind of talking down, or there's a perception that people have no attention span,
Hmm.
and that may be true. There is an attention deficit syndrome at large in the culture because there's so much media.
Mm.
We didn't have iPhones and computers when I was growing up, so our attention span was different. But part of the hidden complexity of 50s movies was the political subtext, because they, there was there was a kind of censorship or restraint, and you couldn't say a lot of things directly, so you would say them indirectly through metaphor and allegory, and it became subtext. Well, a wonderful example of that was a huge hit of the 50s, a Western called High Noon. Do you know that film with Gary Cooper? Political allegory about Hollywood, 1952, even though it's set in the West.
Huh.
And that, without knowing the political background, you can see that the film is very well made, but there's another level to it. The
Right.
science fiction films of the period, Invasion of the Body Snatchers,
Yeah.
is a film with a political subtext.
Absolutely, it is. Yeah.
The Thing from Another World, political subtext.
Yeah.
Them. So the fear of communism percolated throughout the period. And in some films, progressive films or films to the left of center, there was an attack against anti-communism. So there are all this political turmoil that couldn't be handled directly because there was a kind of censorship then that there isn't now. But sometimes in art, if you can't say everything directly, you have to find creative strategies around that. I'm not saying censorship is good, but limitation on what you can and cannot say can be creatively inspiring.